The air inside the Lincoln Memorial Hall felt charged, not with electricity, but with silence. A tension so sharp, it sliced through the murmurs, cutting straight to the bone. The stage lights bathed the panelists in an artificial glow, making their every blink twitch, breath feel like theater, but the stakes were far too real for play acting. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the panel, hands folded, her eyes cool and observant. She wore a midnight blue blazer that fit, her like armor not a thread out of place. To her left, conservative commentator Ben Shapiro had already adjusted his mic 3 times, fingers drumming nervously on the table. He wasn't nervous about debating, he'd done this 1,000 times. But something about tonight, something about her made him tighten his jaw a little more than usual. The moderator had barely finished the question on urban crime rates before Shapiro lunged for the mic, his voice already skating across polished talking points. What we're seeing in America's cities, he began, crisp and sure, is a breakdown of law and order, directly correlated with the rise of progressive policies. The defunding of police, the refusal to prosecute petty crime, these are not coincidences. These are results. He didn't pause to breathe. The data speaks clearly. In cities with weak policing, homicides have surged. Property crime is normalized. Communities, especially minority communities, are the ones who suffer the most. Few audience members nodded. It's the ones who had come to hear Ben win. Crockett didn't move. Not yet. But we can't solve problems, he continued, with emotional appeals or identity politics. We solve them with facts, data, with policy rooted in reason, not rage. Then he did it. Cut her off. I'm sorry, but if we're going to be serious, we can't allow Congresswoman Crockett to derail this with personal anecdotes. This isn't about, she raised one hand, slow, deliberate. A gesture not of panic but of finality. Ben, she said, her voice low and steady. Don't interrupt me. He froze not because the words were loud, but because they weren't. There was no fire, no volume, no outburst. Just an edge in her tone so fine it could draw blood. She turned to face him fully now, the lines around her mouth taut. You want to talk about law and order? Fine. Let's talk. The crowd leaned forward. Something had shifted. I buried 2 brothers by the time I was 24, one shot in the back by a man in uniform. The other left to die in an alley because paramedics didn't feel safe entering the neighborhood. Ben blinked. No sound came. You ever carry a casket? Ben. You ever hold your mother upright at a funeral while the police department sends thoughts and prayers and nothing else? A hush fell over the crowd. She leaned closer, not in anger and warning. You don't interrupt a woman who's buried her brothers. Not when you've never even had to fear for yours. The moderator tried to cut in, but no one listened. The audience was still, frozen. You bring your stats, your pie charts, your maps of violence. But you know what those numbers don't show? She looked out into the sea of watchers. The moment a mother hears that knock on her door, silence of a courtroom that never convicts. The echo of a child's voice in a hallway, he'll never walk again. Ben sat back, stunned into a rare and public silence. And that was the first time in his career. The man known for never losing a debate said nothing at all, not because he was out of facts, but because something deeper had landed.
At something?
Heavier, unanswerable. And Jasmine? She hadn't even raised her voice. Not yet. The event had been marketed like a boxing match, disguised as civility. Uncensored America, crime, culture, and the Constitution. A title crafted to feel neutral, but everyone knew what it was, a collision course built for broadcast. The venue, a vaulted hall with American flags drooping behind the stage, buzzed with cameras, interns, and the quiet hum of a nervous crowd. Ben. Shapiro arrived early, sharp in a tailored charcoal suit. He flipped through index cards covered in statistics, court cases, and rhetorical traps. This was his arena rapid-fire delivery, ironclad logic. A library of sound bites designed to dismantle opponents before they could catch their breath. Jasmine. Crockett walked in 15 minutes later. She didn't carry notes. She didn't need to. Her suit was crimson, bold and unapologetic. She didn't wear it like armor. She wore it like truth. From the moment they sat down, the tension pulsed. The other two panelists, Sherilyn Effiel and Stephen Miller, exchanged stiff nods, already retreating into their respective corners. But the gravitational pull was between Shapiro and Crockett. The moderator, a PBS journalist trying to maintain control of a live-streamed powder keg, cleared his throat. Tonight, we'll explore solutions to urban crime in America's cities. Ben jumped in before the first full question. The truth is, he said, eyes locked forward, we've allowed woke policies to erode public safety. Police officers are afraid to do their jobs. Criminals are emboldened. We have to stop coddling lawlessness. Crockett tilted her head, her eyes unreadable. Democrats have romanticized disorder, Ben continued. They refuse to prosecute crimes, and the communities paying the price? Minority neighborhoods? Every time. A few scattered claps. The crowd was still warming up. Then Jasmine spoke. If you want to talk about crime, Ben, let's talk about who's writing the laws and who they protect. Her voice wasn't loud, but every syllable carried weight. People leaned in. The policies you praise, she said, were written by men who never had to fear being stopped, searched, or shot, who've never been poor, never been hunted, and never been buried by the system they praise. Ben leaned back, smiling tightly, but his fingers tapped faster. The opening bell had rung. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to spar. She came to bury myths. Jasmine leaned forward, palms pressed against the polished surface of the table, voice calm but vibrating with something deeper. Not anger, not even outrage. Grief, the kind of grief that lived in muscle memory, quiet, coiled, and ready. You say crime is rising? She said, eyes fixed on Ben. You say police are handcuffed. But let me ask you something. Ben, have you ever buried someone who called the cops and died anyway? A hush settled over the room. Ben didn't blink. We're talking about facts, not feelings. The data Jasmine cut through a sentence like a blade. No, you're talking about data without cost. You're talking about numbers you read. I'm talking about bodies I've held. She turned slightly, not to him but to the audience. My cousin was shot on his front porch waiting for backup that never came. My neighbor's son was pulled over for a busted taillight and didn't make it home. You want to debate statistics? I'm telling you the ground truth. Ben adjusted his mic. His tone shifted, clipped colder. With respect, your anecdotes, while tragic, don't change the fact that in cities where police pull back, crime goes up. It's not an opinion. That's measurable. She nodded slowly, as if registering the insult wasn't worth a full reaction. You ever ask why they pull back, Ben? You ever think it's not fear of the public, but accountability that they fear most? He scoffed. Police officers are demonized. They're not demonized. She snapped, her voice rising now, no longer trying to be palatable. They're demanded to do a job the system itself set up to fail, to patrol poverty instead of dismantling it. To show up where teachers, therapists, and housing should have been. A few gasps. Sherilyn Effiel nodded silently beside her, lips pursed in. Agreement? Ben leaned into the mic again, slightly flustered. So what's your solution? Disarm them? Defund them? Let the criminals take over the neighborhoods where honest families live in fear? Her reply was immediate. My solution is to stop pretending the badge is a shield for impunity. That's not justice, that's theater. Our communities have paid for that illusion in blood. Moderator glanced nervously at his notepad. The debate was spiraling out of his control, but no one in the audience looked away. Jasmine's voice dropped now, the words slow, deliberate. You don't know the price of policing, Ben, because you've never been on the wrong side of a badge or buried someone who was. Ben froze. For just a second, there was no comeback. No fast talking, no counter statistics. Just the sound of the room breathing around him. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. The first blow had landed, and the crowd felt it. Ben exhaled slowly, gathering himself. The audience's silence had weight not against him, but not with him either. It was used to winning with volume and velocity. But Jasmine had cracked open something deeper. Memory, loss, truth, too heavy for stats. Still, this was his craft. Control the frame, seize the tempo, turn emotion into imbalance. He spoke, voice crisp again. Let me be clear, not discounting. Your personal losses, they're tragic. They deserve justice. But the purpose of law is not grief counseling, it's order. And we're losing it. He glanced at the moderator, then locked eyes with the crowd. There's a narrative being pushed here that policing is inherently oppressive, that every officer is a threat, and that crime is just misunderstood poverty. That's not just. Wrong, it's dangerous, the audience murmured, some nodding, others frowning. Jasmine folded her arms. She didn't speak, not yet. Let him talk. Let the rope unfurl, Ben continued. In 2022, violent crime spiked in cities where police departments were demoralized. Homicide rates rose in places that experimented with defunding. The reality is, when police retreat, predators advance. He paused for effect. And while my colleague here insists we reimagine everything, real people are being carjacked, assaulted, and murdered in the meantime. Children are dying while we debate the root causes. His voice hardened. Justice without safety is a theory. And theories don't protect families at 2 a.m. when someone kicks in their door. There was applause now scattered but louder than before. He leaned in, confident again. I respect passion. Passion doesn't make policy. And what were? Seeing here is the elevation of lived experience over measurable reality. Jasmine's smile was tight. It wasn't amusement. It was recognition, the kind you give to a man who just walked into his own trap. You love facts, she said calmly. You collect them like trophies. You weaponize them like armor. Ben's eyebrow arched. Because they matter. They do, she said. But which ones you choose and which ones you ignore tells me more than any data set. She turned back to the audience. He quoted homicide rates. But not the studies showing police clearance rates for murders in black communities. Barely break 40%. He mentions defunding, but not the millions spent on tanks and tear gas while rape kits sit untested in city labs. She looked at him again, this time with the kind of steel only forged by pain. You call it dangerous to humanize the victims. Of state violence, I call it necessary, because your version of safety never included us. Ben opened his mouth, but she didn't let him speak. You think emotion clouds truth? No, Ben, it reveals it. Your facts are clean because they're detached. Ours are soaked in blood. That's the difference. The room shifted. Something had tilted not in noise but in gravity. The moral center had moved. And for a man who built his brand on being unshakable, Ben Shapiro suddenly looked cautious. He reached for another stat, but the moment had passed. This wasn't about the numbers anymore. It was about who they erased. And Jasmine Crockett had just made that painfully clear. The moderator cleared his throat, too soft to interrupt, too late to mediate. Then came the pivot. From the far end of the panel, Mark Miller leaned into his mic posture, casual, tone deliberately reasonable. Before we turn this into an indictment of all law enforcement, he began, Ken, we talk about something we're not supposed to mention anymore? The uncomfortable fact that most violence in black communities comes from within them? He said it slowly, like dropping gasoline in syllables, waiting for a spark. Jasmine didn't move, but Sherilyn Afiel turned sharply toward him, eyes narrowing like a curtain drawing closed. Miller went on, because I hear a lot about the system. I hear about the badge. But what about responsibility? What about black-on-black crime? Audience bristled, some shifting, some sighing. A few clapped, quietly, like they weren't sure if they should. Jasmine's voice sliced. The space like silk on steel. Let me stop you right there. No anger. Just the kind of clarity that kills. Softly. That phrase, black and black crime, doesn't mean what you think it means. It's not a statistic. It's a diversion. Miller raised his brow. Oh, so you deny it exists? No, she said. I deny that it excuses the system's failures. I deny that it erases the root causes. And I damn sure deny the idea that we're more violent when white communities also commit crime against themselves, but nobody turns it into a pathology. She leaned forward, eyes locked on his. Tell me something, Mark. What do you call it when a government deliberately redlines a neighborhood, underfunds its schools, floods it with narcotics, and then over-polices the very chaos it created? Paused, because where I come from, we call that war. Gasps, not loud but collective. A tightening in the room. Ben looked down. Shapiro wouldn't touch that line, but Miller smiled slick and unbothered. War. That's a bit dramatic, isn't it? What about the personal choices people make? Single-parent homes, gang culture? He leaned back, smug. He thought he'd landed a blow, but Jasmine just nodded. You want to talk about choices? Let's talk. She turned to the audience now, voice rising just enough to fill the corners of the hall. My mother chose to keep food on our table while her boss paid her less than a man. Elokata less than a man. My uncle chose to raise 3 boys after the police shot his brother during a traffic stop. One chose to run for office in a district where the mailman wore a bulletproof vest. Another breath, we've all made choices, Mr. Miller. But don't you dare talk about choice without talking about the cage we were born inside. Miller said nothing. He looked suddenly unsure of the notes in front of him and the audience. Once teetering had begun to lean, not just toward Jasmine, but away from the frame they'd been handed, because something had broken. The illusion of neutrality, the myth of merit. The script that always centered whiteness as objective and blackness. As anecdotal, Sherilyn spoke, now soft, almost gentle. Safety, she said, is not defined by those who already have it. The line hit like scripture. Jasmine sat back, calm, resolute. Because Miller's pivot hadn't just failed. It had revealed the question no one wanted to answer. Who gets to define danger? And who gets to survive it? Ben Shapiro had been silent. Too long. The kind of silence that isn't strategic but boiling. He shifted in his chair, thumb flicking against the side of his notepad. Eyes darting back and forth as if calibrating a missile. And then he struck. All right, he said, voice clipped and sharp. So let me see if I understand this correctly. Every problem in America, every single disparity, is the fault of some omnipresent, systemic villain that nobody can see, touch, or define. Jasmine didn't flinch, her chin lifted half an inch, but she didn't speak. Ben kept going too fast, like he couldn't slow down. And if someone dares bring up accountability, if someone cites actual data, or makes the obvious observation that crime is a personal decision, then we're gaslighting. We're racist? That's the new rule? He laughed once. It was dry and humorless. This isn't debate. This is performance art. The moderator opened his mouth, then closed it again. Jasmine leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. Voice came low, deliberate. No, Ben. What you're doing is performance. The charts. A few audience members chuckled, but she wasn't smiling. Don't confuse speaking from lived pain with theatrics. We weren't taught this in prep school. We lived it. We buried it. We wear it under our skin. Ben threw his pen down. A little too hard. It clattered across the table. You keep saying we and us and our. That's not argument. That's emotional manipulation. Jasmine looked at him now, not with contempt, with something far more disarming. Understanding. You want me to be abstract, Ben? You want me to detach from the blood in my stories? So, your audience feels comfortable? He said nothing. She nodded slowly. All right. Let's go abstract. She turned to the audience. In 2021, over 1,000 people were killed by police in the U.S. Black Americans were nearly 3 times more likely to be killed than white Americans, despite being only 13% of the population. She glanced back at Ben. That's not anecdotal. That's data. You like those, right? He opened his mouth again, but this time no sound came. You quote numbers like armor, she continued, but you strip them of context. You quote murder rates without mentioning poverty rates. You talk about welfare dependency without naming the billionaires who depend on tax loopholes. A pause. And you want to talk about personal choices? My brother chose to walk to the corner store in a hoodie. He never came back. The room froze. Ben blinked. Jasmine's voice dropped again, quieter, heavier. So yes, it's personal. It always was. You just didn't notice until now. Silence that followed wasn't passive. It was dense, loaded, as if the whole audience had exhaled, but no one wanted to be the first to breathe back in. Ben reached for his water. His hand shook slightly. It was the first time he looked small, not because he had lost a debate, but because something had slipped through the cracks in his tone, in his tactics, a truth too heavy for statistics, and for once, Ben Shapiro had nothing left to say. The moderator leaned in, trying to regain control. Let's move on to But Ben wasn't done. He straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing, voice tight with controlled rage. You know what, Jasmine? You keep making this about identity, about your grief, your trauma, your background. But some of us are here to talk about policy, not poetry. A ripple went through the room. The kind of murmur that precedes a thunderstorm. Jasmine turned slowly, like someone deciding whether to put out a fire or let it burn. Her voice came low, steady. What you just said wasn't accidental. Ben raised an eyebrow. It's always been the same script, hasn't it? She continued. When a woman speaks with emotion, she's unstable. When a black woman does it, she's irrational. Loud. Unhinged. Ben cut in. Don't twist my don't interrupt me, Jasmine said, sharply now. The crowd gasped. Ben recoiled, slightly surprised by the force behind the words. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't even raising her voice. She just wasn't shrinking. You don't interrupt a woman who buried her brothers. Ben, she said. You don't talk over someone who's survived what you only studied. Ben blinked. Once, twice. But she didn't stop. You love to throw around words like facts don't care about your feelings. But you weaponize your detachment like it's some kind of moral high ground. She leaned forward. Tell me when your facts erase the people they describe. Whose truth are you really defending? He didn't answer. The moderator stayed frozen, unsure if this was still a debate or something. Else entirely, the room was holding its breath. Let me tell you something about feelings, she said. Grief is a political force. Love is revolutionary. Rage, when rooted in truth, has rewritten history more times than your footnotes ever could. The words didn't just land, they resonated, like echoes in a bell tower. Somewhere in the back, a woman stood and clapped once loud, defiant. Then another, and another. It spread like fire. Ben looked around, eyes flicking from the audience to the cameras. The room had turned, not with hatred but clarity. They weren't angry at him. They just weren't hypnotized anymore. On Twitter, clip would be clipped to 16 seconds. You don't interrupt a woman who buried her brothers, Ben. Would trend in under an hour. The angle would be tight. Jasmine's jaw clenched, her eyes shimmering with a mix of fury and composure. A modern portrait of unflinching defiance. Ben sat back in his chair, lips pressed tight, and for the first time in the debate, the silence was his, not chosen, earned. Ben sat rigid, jaw tight, blinking fast as though trying to regain footing after a verbal blow he hadn't seen coming. The moderator cleared his throat. We'd like to pivot now to questions about constitutional interpretation. Mr. Shapiro, Congresswoman Crockett, if you but Jasmine was already leaning forward. Again, I'd actually like to stay here, she said, since we're talking about facts. She placed her hands flat on the table. Let's talk about the Constitution. You know it well, don't you, Ben? Shapiro gave a cautious nod. Yes. I've spent my career, I know, she interrupted, mirroring his earlier tone. You've read it, memorized it, quoted it, debated it like it's scripture. Ben straightened slightly, sensing a trap. But see, she continued, for some of us, the Constitution wasn't a document in a classroom. It was a wall, a weight, a contradiction. The room fell, quiet again. You speak about it with reverence. We lived it with restraint. You frame your identity around liberty. We were still fighting to be counted as fully human when your version of liberty was already canon. She paused, eyes fixed on him. You memorized it. We bled for it. It was the line that would go viral. It's not because it was poetic, but because it was real. Ben opened his mouth, then shut it. He knew better than to reach for a counterpoint when the air still pulsed with that sentence. Jasmine went on, her voice lower now, not for drama, but for weight. My grandfather couldn't vote without fear. My mother was followed around department stores in the 90s. I had to outperform threefold to be heard in law. School just to sit on this stage and be told my pain is too emotional for a debate. Ben shifted uncomfortably. That's the luxury of detachment, she said. You get to dissect the Constitution like it's a neutral artifact. But I come from people who had to negotiate their humanity under the very laws you quote like gospel. A cameraman zoomed in tight on her face. She wasn't angry now. She was exhausted, but not defeated. In your world, liberty is an abstraction. Mine, it's an inheritance stolen and slowly clawed back, inch by inch courtroom. By courtroom, Shapiro finally spoke. So what, Jasmine? You want to rewrite the Constitution every time history wounds someone? She blinked once. Slowly, no, she said. I want us to read it with the blood still on the page. Gasps fluttered across the audience like wind through dry leaves. Shapiro leaned back, trying to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Jasmine didn't wait for the moderator. She looked out into the crowd. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for accountability. And if that shakes you, maybe you weren't as grounded in your facts as you thought. A hush followed. Not empty silence, but the kind that arrives when someone tells the truth in a room full of people who've been trained to look away. The debate wasn't over, but for the first time, the Constitution didn't feel like Shapiro's weapon. It felt like Crockett's testimony, and this time, people were listening. Outside the debate hall, night had fallen. Inside, something else had descended, not darkness, but understanding. The moderator looked shell-shocked. His cue cards lay limp in his hand, the script unraveling in real time. For all the planned questions about taxes, immigration, and judicial appointments, no one had written a cue card for this. The audience, once restless, now leaned in, as if afraid to blink. Even the lights seemed quieter, warmer, as if dimmed out, of reverence. Ben Shapiro crossed his arms. His posture said confidence, but his silence said strategy. He knew he'd lost control of the room, not with a gaffe, but with a revelation. Jasmine Crockett wasn't performing. She was surviving. Liv. A young woman in the third row wiped her eyes. She hadn't expected to cry at a policy debate, but something in Jasmine's voice, the ache when she said, read it with the blood still on the page. It clung to her ribs like a song. Half-Dash remembered an older man in a veteran's cap nodded slowly. He didn't agree with her on everything. Maybe not even most things, but damn if she hadn't earned the mic. Even the students in the back row, the ones who came for a selfie with Shapiro or a soundbite from Crockett, now sat stone still. Their phones were still filming, but no one was scrolling anymore. And on stage, Jasmine felt it shift. Not applause. Not applause yet. Something deeper. Respect. Maybe the first real kind she'd felt in months. She sat back in her chair, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. Her hands were clasped on the table now, not clenched. Ben finally spoke, voice low. Careful, Congresswoman. I think we both care about this country deeply, but we approach its story from very different paths. Jasmine nodded. That's fair. He continued. I believe in personal responsibility in data, in logic. So do I, she replied. But I also believe in memory, trauma, and the body as archive. You want to talk about the country like a machine? I want to talk about it like a scarred heirloom. Ben's brow furrowed. Logic without memory is anesthesia, she added. You feel nothing, but the wound's still there. Even he couldn't hide the flicker of something in his face. Not agreement, but recognition. The moderator cleared his throat. I think we're going to take a brief pause before closing statements. He didn't say why, but everyone knew the room needed to breathe. As the stage lights faded for intermission, soft hum filled the room. Not applause, not yet. Just murmurs, glances. A quiet processing of what had just happened. It wasn't a knockout. It was a recalibration, 1,000 silent reckonings all happening at once. Outside, the hashtags were already forming. Read it with the blood. Crockett infiltrated Shapiro via Crockett, but inside the room, something older than algorithms was taking place. People weren't picking sides. They were waking up, and Jasmine, for the first time all night, allowed herself to exhale, not because it was over, but because it had begun. The debate resumed. But the momentum had shifted. What followed felt less like political sparring and more like a courtroom. After a witness breaks down where every word that follows is just paperwork, Ben spoke. He leaned back into his numbers, citing percentages on incarceration, academic performance, fatherless homes, the usual arsenal. But something was missing. His voice, usually so sharp it could slice through any interruption, now carried the faint timbre of someone speaking into fog. Clear, but disconnected. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The silence she left hanging after each of his claims did more than rebuttal ever could. "Do you have any response, Congresswoman?" the moderator asked, glancing nervously. At the clock, she looked out at the audience instead of her opponent. "When my brothers were buried," she began slowly, "not a single statistic walked through our door. Not one percentage brought us comfort. Not one graph held my mother's hand when she couldn't breathe through her grief." She turned to Ben. "You weaponize numbers the way surgeons use scalpels, but the people I represent, we don't get anesthesia. We bleed through the charts you print." Ben stared at her. "No, come back." "Not this time." A hush settled across the room. Cameras were rolling, live streams were spiking, but the atmosphere in that hall couldn't be reduced to pixels or views. It was the kind of silence that haunts institutions. It's the kind that doesn't fade with applause. Jasmine folded her notes. "You asked earlier why I make things personal," she said. "Because our politics have always been personal. You just never had to pay that price." The moderator cleared his throat. "Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you both for—" But Jasmine raised her hand gently. "One last thing." She looked at the camera. "Speak your truth. Even if your voice shakes. Especially if it shakes." She stood and walked off the stage. Ben remained seated, staring, processing. The room stayed quiet. Then, slowly, people began to rise to their feet, not clapping. Just standing, witnessing, a kind of unspoken tribute, in a debate that began with interruptions. It was the silence that won. Outside the debate hall, night air was thick with possibility. A few protesters still lingered behind barricades, holding faded signs, but even their chants had softened into murmurs. The crowd had thinned, but the story was just beginning to spread. Inside, the stage was empty now. Microphones cold, chairs still warm. Jasmine Crockett stood backstage, hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm tea. She wasn't drinking it, just holding it like an anchor. An aide approached, breathless, trending across platforms. "You're on every feed. Read it with the blood is everywhere." Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need viral validation. She'd buried her. "Brothers, this wasn't about clout. It was about presence. It was about consequence." Back in the hall, Ben Shapiro remained behind, speaking with a small cluster of students. He answered their questions respectfully, thoughtfully, but there was a visible shift to humility, or maybe just the weight of a conversation he hadn't expected to lose control of. A camera caught him alone moments later, not rehearsing talking points, just thinking. And that in itself was a kind of justice, not the loud, gavel-striking kind, the kind that whispers change. Later that night, Jasmine sat at her hotel desk, shoes off, blazer draped across the back of a chair. A single lamp glowed over a stack of handwritten notes, the kind she never read from but always kept near. She picked up one, a folded letter, creased in thirds. The ink faded, but still legible. It was from one of her brothers. The last one, she. Read it slowly, lips barely moving, eyes glossed over, not with sadness, but with resolve. "Don't just fight for me. Fight like you're the one who didn't make it, because that's how I live now. In your skin, through your voice." A knock at the door. A staffer peeked in. "They want you on MSNBC. Primetime, you ready?" She folded the letter, slipped it back in her pocket. "I was born ready," she said softly, then paused. "No, that's not true." She looked up, voice firmer. "I became ready the moment I stopped asking for permission to tell the truth." She stood, walked past the mirror, didn't even glance at it. She knew who she was, and tonight, so did the rest of the country. The final image wasn't her speech, not a headline, not a hashtag. It was a shot, low angle, wide lens of her silhouette stepping into the frame lights of a live studio. A woman carrying not just her own story, but the weight of ghosts, the heat of memory, and the kind of voice that doesn't echo at graves. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Poetic. Justice doesn't scream. It stands and lets the world listen. Fade to black.